endpoint environments. On the cloud side, we focus on the same thing with a sensor that we built in-house that similarly takes in context around the cloud environment and helps us find signs of malicious behavior in those environments. Overall, we are just about making sure that companies have the right security outcome. In a lot of ways, we're agnostic to the solution that gets them there, and focus a lot more on making sure that people have the tools and resources and education necessary to be successful, both on endpoints and in the cloud, without a lot of fear that comes with it. So definitely a great company to check out. In particular, I love our resources, both the blogs, white papers, webinars. They're really geared toward both kind of nice overviews of topics within security and to a degree now DevOps, but also deep dives into how to detect attacks, how to react to them, things like Bazaar as they pop up. What steps do we need to do to both secure ourselves and react to that threat if we see it in our environments? Overall, we're kind of structured as what we call a security operations platform. And the goal of that is to take in data and tools and information from any and all security tools you might be using and help you kind of centralize into the alerts in the context that matters. So in many ways, it kind of looks and feels like a SIM. It's not a SIM traditionally, but it's making sure that as you have these endpoints and then you grow your cloud environments and then you have all these tools generating what could be valuable alerts, usually false positives, unfortunately, but valuable alerts around your network, your SaaS tools, whatever it might be. We can pipe those in and put them in context of everything else we're seeing and give you kind of a single pane of glass into not only here's the problem, but here's all the things you can go do to actually address that problem. And then notify you quickly so you can get waken up at 3 in the morning to go deal with whatever the new crisis is, which inevitably is something that someone's caused or is a false positive. So it's a great part about the industry, but yeah, we really believe in the combination of, again, that people, process, technology to make sure that when you're operating at any scale in the cloud or locally, you can have the confidence that you're going to get alerted to things that matter and then not have to focus your attention on this problem necessarily for the rest of the time. So the cloud side itself, we have a lot of interesting challenges that we've been profiling. Personally, I've been in this space for a number of years now. From a Red Canary perspective, we've been in it for about a year, looking at cloud in particular. And we look at the security challenges a little bit differently. First as a business level challenge, and then as an actual, how do you actually go and do this challenge? So on the cloud side, this is not going to be a surprise to a single person here. Linux and cloud are ubiquitous. The latest numbers up this year are 88% of organizations using the cloud. It makes up a vast majority of what you see in AWS and GCP. And surprisingly, the majority of what you see in Azure as well. It's actually 60% now. And so the focus traditionally has been on Windows and Mac as far as security goes. If you're within cloud and Linux, it's typically been on kind of risk and configuration and a lot less on threats. So companies going to the cloud at this point, they're kind of going in with a strong knowledge of deployment and infrastructure and those aspects of it. But I think a real struggle in understanding actual practical security for the cloud. How do we know that that thing that we deploy out into AWS is actually secure? Like we know that AWS is looking at some things. We were joking about the, hey, 2,600 of your workloads are just hit with a scan. Those kind of things are taking place in these cloud environments, but inside the actual host that you're working on, they're completely punting the problem to you to assume that you have the knowledge to both properly secure these and care about what's running on it. It's not being essentially hit with malicious act or malicious activity. The other fun part is the customer trends, and we get the opportunity to talk to a lot of companies. They're either just asking us advice on what they should do, or customers of Red Canary. And cloud workloads came up very early on. This is actually why we invested in this space. We had essentially a pretty strong body of our customers come to us and say, it's great that you have endpoints locked down. EDR is very mature, MDR is very mature. We have good insight and managed response and managed SOC teams focusing on our endpoints. But we have all these cloud workloads, and whether they want to admit it or not, a lot of people actually do. There's basically no eyes on these. In many cases, they're being spun up dynamically by engineering, and there's the assumption that as long as the image is okay, or as long as they configured it properly, or they know what applications are in that image, it's totally safe and good to go. Also, if it spins down in 30 minutes, it's totally good to go. And obviously, there are some gaps and some problems with that. The other fun twist that comes with it is that majority of the security teams that are stood up are operating in the endpoint space, or they're operating in the application security space, but not necessarily in the cloud. It could be an ownership problem. It could be that cloud is owned by DevOps or engineering or infrastructure or the SRE team, whoever it might be, and as a result, they don't have a lot of insight and influence there. Or it could just be from a lack of knowledge and experience with cloud workloads. They kind of have to trust what's existing, or again, in many cases, not malicious in any way, kind of overlook the problem to deal with more severe or well-understood threats in their environment. The other fun part about it is that, in our opinion at least, and I share this opinion pretty deeply, the customer needs just not being met. Historically, a lot of tools in this space, and I'm sure you're familiar with any and all of these across the board, focus on the left side of this chart on the bottom right here. We've really nailed the idea of testing our code before we deploy it. We've nailed the idea of regular penetration testing, whether static or manual, or actually at the code level. We're going through code reviews in our team to make sure that we have nothing obvious being introduced, like moving a piece of customer data where it doesn't belong, and we can plan and do static analysis all we want to. There are lots of great platforms to do that. It's really the bread and butter of a lot of the managed services in places like AWS and GCP, where you have a lot of help in knowing that you've configured right, you've pulled down safe, stable images, you don't have obvious vulnerabilities like ports that shouldn't be open, or you're running Rails 6 or Rails 5 in production. And so that's a great part of the safety net. That's basically saying that what I deploy out is going to provide me a baseline level of safety and security, and I can have a lot of trust into it. But I kind of think of it like a car. So you get the safest car, you wear your seatbelt, it has the airbags and everything. The problem is when you go out and drive on the highway and everyone else is out there. And now you have to trust that all of those things are going to keep you safe and perfectly good to go, with the realization that if you get hit by the car, your car is out of service in the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is you have to go test all of your ultimately safety net features to make sure that they're keeping you safe. So it opens up this interesting opportunity that we really focused in on threats. And threats here consist of anything that's going to be actively testing all of those safety nets you've deployed out. This could be a malicious state actor. This could be somebody out there looking to get access to your systems. It could be someone looking to steal data and steal source code. It could be something like we just saw with CD Projekt Red this week. It could also be an internal employee, both motivated either by that or just taking malicious actions within your environment. The hope is that the systems we put in place on the left there completely protect us, but practically, usually they don't. And we don't even know about it until it's already taken place. Pick your poison of news stories from this and last year as far as hacks and breaches. It's usually coming from a threat exploiting something that is an unmitigated risk. And so really what we saw as we looked around is that a lot of people weren't focusing on this side of it. It's very hard to get a good threat and detection platform built up. And it's really one of the opportunities to catch things as they happen so that you don't have to have your kind of second or third tier safety mechanisms triggered to prevent a problem, nor do you have to figure out that something went wrong 3 or 4 months later or years later, depending on what it is. The problem is compounded by every fun thing we're doing in the cloud. So since we have a lot of focus on the infrastructure, DevOps, SRE teams being able to spin up tools and capabilities very quickly, it also means that we're basically further compounding a visibility problem across the board. Ephemeral workloads make it super hard. So again, that assumption that you can spin something up for 30 minutes, serve the spike, and then spin it back down without security risk is a clearly flawed notion. But those workloads are also spinning up and down so quickly that we're not capturing a lot of the context around the threat. We don't even know if that image has a problem. We don't know if there's a vulnerability that's being exploited. We don't know if they jumped out of that container into the rest of the cluster or the rest of our infrastructure. There's just the assumption that you're so quick that it's not going to get caught. It also makes scaling a nightmare because your inventory, while it might typically be 200 servers or 500 servers, can rapidly spin up and down by hundreds of thousands in a month. And so are you going to go throw 15, 20, 30 people at that problem to figure it out? No, you're going to make the assumption that nothing's wrong. The image problem and the fragmentation across Linux in general is also a big problem here. Everyone, doesn't want to have it be the case, but I've yet to talk to a company in my career where they didn't have a RHEL 5. They didn't have some ancient system hanging around out there. Pick your poison of operating systems. It's the same case across the board. And so you have to have people sitting who both have the expertise of knowing what they're deploying out and what risks and vulnerabilities that might introduce, while also combating the notion that they're not experts in the space. And particularly on the development side, they're going to pick the image that provides the best outcomes for them. It's typically things like lightweight, scale, performance, et cetera. And they're not necessarily going to look at how it plays into their security stack or what vulnerabilities or risks it might introduce. The inventory question is another big challenge. It's super lucky if you only have 20 EC2 instances on your AWS account. That's rarely the case though. You've got some mix of on-prem. You have that one or two people who want to run a Linux laptop for whatever reason. You've got these this containerized set over here that someone's playing with. You've got a couple of VMs. There's a dev and a staging environment. And so it basically makes it impossible to sit and know exactly what you have deployed out at any given time without, again, dedicating somebody or some team to go look at that problem and dig into it. The consequences, not going to be a surprise to anyone here, extremely painful across the board. The average cost for breach spiked up last year to 3.8 million. That's average for larger companies there. We're seeing a big pattern, particularly as you look at things like SolarWinds, of these long-term, extremely complex and sophisticated breaches, where even a company that is invested in the best outcomes and invested in progressive solutions for security problems for companies can themselves be exploited by a zero-day or exploited by a threat actor that, in theory, could have been caught. It dialed out to a command and control address, but in practice was not called for over 6 months. And the trust problem is still a classic issue. It's just generally impossible to rebuild the trust after you've had an incident like this, particularly for the longer it goes on. And so not having visibility, not knowing if there are threats present in your environment itself becomes this compounding issue where you're essentially playing a waiting game with a ticking time bomb. And when that goes off, you're losing that trust, you're losing that revenue, you're losing that data, and you're only hoping that you find it in time. When, again, on average, unless it's a very sophisticated attack looking for a specific piece of data, it's going to be a long-lasting thing sitting on your systems. So it's heavy. I don't want to paint doom and gloom. I want to paint something a little bit more friendly. So now what? Nothing surprising here. Basically, we need to spend as much time looking at the threats and runtime threats within these environments, as well as looking at risk. That's what we've done at Red Canary on the cloud workload protection side. This is not a pitch for cloud workload protection, though. I more want to paint the criteria for what you should be looking for, as you go out and begin to evaluate solutions for understanding runtime threats in your environment, so you can make an informed decision. The main reason I lean in that direction is because this is a relatively new space. The term was coined within the last 2 years for what these tools even do. The historic research on this side of it has been weak at best. When you think about threats and exploits and new vulnerabilities in 0 days, you're primarily operating in Windows land, sometimes Mac, very rarely Linux. And so a lot of the security community broadly, our time hasn't been focused in this space. So typically, again, when we think about tools here, we're thinking about static code analysis, penetration testing, locking down my image, closing off ports, doing all those protective measures, and not really thinking about actively hunting for threats that are in our systems today. So we basically align to this philosophy. There are plenty of tools in the market that do this to varying degrees with various nuances, but the best way we found to protect the cloud on the runtime threat side is through a sensor-based technology. There's a pick your poison method here. We have our own. There's a CrowdStrike. There's a Carbon Black. There's a Sentinel-1. There's a Microsoft version of this for Linux, believe it or not. And their job is to go into your environment, hopefully in a safe and performant way. So you get the interesting break between a kernel mode sensor and a user mode sensor. Collect the right information coming back from that environment, usually in the form of telemetry coming back from the host itself. Run that through some form of detection capability that's looking for a number of things. It can be applications that are clearly malicious that are running. It can be the presence of a file that's basically rootkit.exe sitting within your systems. It can be behaviors like a process getting hidden or task getting hidden frequently, or memory on a process that's running getting manipulated in real time. You want to have a combination of all of those signs and triggers so that you can form detections on top of that, and then alert essentially on malicious behavior. And then broadly, you're looking for the ability to triage and respond. That can be internally within your team using your own SOC and either kind of spinning up your own detection capabilities or leveraging a vendor's detection capabilities, and then responding as soon as possible with the most nuanced information possible. Typically, it's not just going to be the alert. The alert might just be a behavior or an activity to a threat that actually requires intervention at a different stage or intervention from a little bit of a different angle that you might get from that threat itself. So this next kind of section here profiles what to look for when you're looking in this space. And just to underpin it again, there are many solutions here. There are many, many nuances depending on what you're running and where you're running it and what your concerns really are. But in general, we at Red Canary evaluate our partners really, really aggressively to look for people that provide the right mix of essentially telemetry and data, detection capabilities, response outcomes, support, etc., so that customers can confidently deploy any number of solutions and get back the right security outcomes. So this is what we've learned by going out to the field for the last 6 years, kind of on the endpoint side, as well as the last year and a half on the cloud side. So the first major component to look for is that your tools need to have support for your environments. And this seems like a given. You know, if you have a primarily Windows network, for example, you're not going to pick a tool that only supports Mac. The nuance in the cloud is just that there's so much fragmentation across the space. From a cloud provider perspective, there's of course the big three. And within each of those, there's any number of accounts. You may have a multi-cloud deployment where you have 80% of your infrastructure in AWS and 20% in Google, for example. And so you need to find tools that support both of those. And traditionally, that's two different tools. Under that, there's all of these services that you may be dialed into. You could be all the way on the left here, on bare metal, running everything in-house and throwing your own expertise in the securing these applications. You could be kind of in the middle, riding on like an EC2, ECS, and kind of managing your own applications within those, but trusting the cloud provider for some of that baseline security, particularly the physical security that comes with that. Or you could be all the way on the right, where the keys to the castle are handed all the way over to the cloud provider, and you're running on, you know, something like an AKS or a GKE, where you have a relatively managed platform or relatively managed distribution, or all the way over to something like Amazon Fargate, where you're just deploying out your application and they're going to take care of the rest of it. So the real difficulty and the nuance here comes into how do you pick something that's going to address all of these at once, and how do you pick something that's going to be flexible enough for all these use cases. I will tell you, having spent the last year in this market, there is not a single check-the-box answer for any of this. And your evaluation as you look through tools and runtime threat really needs to look at these and understand exactly what you're using and make sure that you have an answer for each of them. The good news about the managed services is that they're managed, and so your need goes down a little bit, but it's not a given at all. It's worth investigating. The other fun nuance is platforms, of course, essentially Linux distributions. There's an endless number of flavors and versions, and underneath all of those, there's an endless number of subversions, kernel versions, everything else under the sun. I've yet to run into anybody who's just on CentOS, just on Amazon Linux 2, just on SUSE. There's always some mix of it, and I constantly, kind of as I was saying, run into somebody who's deployed on something that has been end of life for 5 or 6 years. And so it's not a given that tools support them. Depending on how tools in this space are built and developed, they may run on some of the older versions of Linux, or they will absolutely never run on older versions of Linux. Our philosophy is that you should never have to roadmap your security initiatives based on your security tools. And I think it's just an important thing to make into your evaluation of any tool running in the cloud. If they're not supporting you in a way that kind of has their roadmap aligned to your future objectives, let's say you want to upgrade the CentOS stream whenever that becomes the thing forced upon us, they should already be there so that you don't have to wait. And the last major challenge here is containers. It's a whole different beast. There's endless arguments of whether you need to care about the host or the cluster or the pod or the container. You just need to make sure that any tool that you're using supports at least one of those use cases. and more importantly, supports that use case for your engineering, your application, your SRE team, who are going to have serious concerns about you deploying something out into your cluster or deploying something out that could potentially have negative performance implications within your containerized deployment. Detections are the other fun aspect of this, and this is where we kind of pivot into the security side of things. So the other really interesting nuance about cloud workloads compared to endpoints typically is that the detection profile looks and feels entirely different than what you're actually traditionally looking for in EDR or even antivirus to a certain degree. On the endpoint side, it's really driven by user behaviors. Someone brute force attacks against the password, someone downloaded the wrong file, there's a phishing campaign and it was successful. Those are going to look and smell a lot different from a detection perspective than what we see in cloud environments, where it's a lot more about traffic. It's a lot more about, is the process memory still have the right, essentially, is it trustworthy? Integrals, the word I was going for there. And can you trust that the application that's running is actually the application that's running? You would get to the fun user activity side of things where did someone run a shell command that is malicious? Is somebody demonstrating a pattern of behaviors that are potentially malicious? Do I know if I have a rootkit present in my systems? How do I know that? Scanning for the rootkit file might get you a result, but realistically, you want to look for things like hidden tasks in your environment. So what we've learned is that you essentially have to, from the ground up, rewrite a lot of your detection capabilities to really look and feel for the things that are cloud threats. And so it's all of those nuances. It's combining a lot of our experience from EDR as an industry and knowing that certain patterns of user behaviors or certain application behaviors lead to a likely security incident, and just tuning and tweaking that philosophy for cloud. These are things that we're currently exploring today, as well as some other interesting things like process memory integrity, privilege escalation, code injection. Basically, how broad can you get in terms of things that could be exploited in cloud environments, and then how deep can you get into those? Another aspect we consider to be really important when you're looking at solutions like this is to look at things like MITRE attack techniques and see if you can tie back the alerts you're getting back on detection capabilities to MITRE attack techniques and tactics, so that instead of just getting the status quo, which is an alert of a high severity risk or a threat in your environment, you actually get back information about exactly how that got there. So you can take a little bit of a further step in the investigation and get a head start on triaging it and scaling out from there. And that also goes back to the question about why containers are so hard and why proliferation is so hard, is that, again, you don't necessarily have context that every single server and every single container is on exactly the same image and everything is exactly up to date. And so to fix the problem, I just reimage everything. That's fine. That's never going to be the case. So it's helpful to know how and why somebody exploited a particular system, know which systems are vulnerable to that, and then apply fixes across the board to it. Not just, kill the machine and reimage it and call the threat mitigated. That's not going to work. Lastly, operational efficiency. And this is when we have to give a nod over to our DevOps teams to kind of lean and hold hands on deploying out software like this. Basically, the first thing we learned talking to this group of users is that in cloud, the keys to the castle are in DevOps and SRE. They're not in security. And to fit into a world where DevOps and SRE have so much influence is to make sure that the solutions you're rolling out into their environment really consider the things they care about. And the two things they care about are going to be CPU usage and memory. If you're deployed in an actual cloud hosted provider, those are the two things that cost you money. Those are the things that are going to care about when they get the AWS bill every single month. From a site reliability perspective, overusing resources in a lot of these deployments means that you're either causing a degraded performance on the business application or an actual production app, or you're about to bring it down, which will lead to catastrophic downtime, big bill, big bad day for them, and an even worse day for people like us supporting those applications. So we learned pretty quickly that the best thing you can do when you look at these tools, assuming you're looking at them through a security lens, is to really evaluate safety and performance. Can it be easily deployed out? Does it fit into existing deployment mechanisms, whether it's being baked into a base image, deploying out through a Kubernetes cluster, going out through the deployment orchestration tool like an Ansible or Salt, Puppet, Chef. knowing what you use and making sure that that's actually something that can be supported is huge. It's even tiny things you wouldn't expect, like, do I need to do any additional configuration or upgrading on the sensor or agent or service once it's deployed out? Because each of those are a change management process, requires multiple levels of approval and review. It just becomes frustrating for people that you want to be allies with, but they have a completely different set of responsibilities and concerns for these applications. Performance impact's the other big one. Security tools need to use a certain amount of resources. It's an industry standard that security tools are going to use something like 5 to 10% of your CPU. It doesn't necessarily have to be the case though. You can use less than that and be successful. But what you really want to do is make sure the tools you're deploying out aren't using 40 or 50% of your CPU. They don't spike when something happens. They have a consistent pattern. They're reliable. They're predictable. Those are all real big considerations for the person who more than likely is going to get woken up by the alert whenever as the vendor, whenever your sensor fails. They're the person who's going to have to suffer at first because they're going to get woken up to go deal with it. They're going to see this 45% spike in CPU utilization, and you're going to get a phone call as well to go deal with the problem. One of the big considerations too when you're talking about these is whether you're running as a kernel module or in user land. So one of the popular ways to get at a lot of data and detecting runtime threats in these environments is to set up kernel modules. If you're not super familiar with those, the best way to think about it is each Linux distribution and the kernel underneath it offers APIs and services that you can tap into to get certain pieces of information. If you're running as a kernel module, you have a really deep integration to the heart of that server, essentially. And you have to write a lot of bespoke code to support getting the information you need. As a result, it's taxing on the application. And when things go wrong, it's going to really ramp up and spike on resource utilization, potentially. It also involves a little bit of questionable tactics when getting deployed as a kernel module. It looks and feels like code injection and hooking. And so there's sometimes a fear about deploying out things like that. The newer, or ironically traditional way of doing this is to deploy out as in user mode. So you're running essentially as a root application. You can consume a lot of information. You've got to get a little bit more crafty about how you get that information. But it provides you a protective layer where if your application goes down, it's an application dying on the server. It's not bringing down the server itself. And there's also lots of new horizons, like using something like eBPF to kind of sit in between a kernel module and a user mode application, get a lot more access to information that's going to help you have better security outcomes, again, without that massive impact on the machine. But basically the gist of this one is make sure that your vendor cares about this and proactively cares about it. Don't let it be a footnote because, again, the team that you want to really be an ally with and deploying stuff into the cloud cares about this first. And to be completely honest, they're not going to care about detection outcomes. They're not going to care about, graphing out where the threat in the process. They're not going to care about any of the bells and whistles and how cool the reporting and the UI is if it's bringing down your SaaS application or your business level applications. And then being proactive about it too is also great. So if you see vendors offer up real-time performance monitoring, integrate into things like your Datadog, your APM, and provide you ways to actually deal with performance issues, like a safe mode tool set, for example. Those are all good signs of a great application and people thinking proactively about the audience they're actually serving. So that's generally kind of what we're seeing when we go into the cloud. We're built on a team of people who have been around this environment for, in many cases, decades, but from an offering perspective, we're new to it. We're always learning, and it's always exciting to talk to people who have a lot of responsibility and influence in this space. The last little part of my kind of spiel I'll throw at you is the outcomes you should be looking for. So if you can check all of these boxes, at least in my opinion, you've ended up in a good spot with the relationships you're building with your vendors and your security tools. Make sure that things are purpose-built for cloud. There is a nuance. It's massive. You cannot just throw EDR at these and call it day. Make sure the detections are cloud first, and you're really looking at the threats that are pervasive in cloud environments and spending your resources on things that matter, not checking the box on some detection capabilities while sacrificing others. And last is make sure you find a great security ally. One thing I always love to hear when I talk to both customers and prospects is just that they're excited to get on the phone and talk security. That's how we approach our work every day. That's how a lot of our kind of idols in the market, as far as other vendors, approach their job every day. And it forms this great relationship where customers can be a little bit vulnerable about their environment and what they are or are not looking for. And in return, they can get kind of a helping hand. One thing I love about working for Red Canary in particular is that we will always recommend the best solution, not necessarily our solution or anything we have anything to do with. So I've often, even in conversations about my own product, have recommended other solutions to people based on the outcome they're looking for. And that's really the thing you should be kind of dangling toward is allyship and not basically a vendor relationship. As far as our offering, we do have a cloud workload protection offering. I'll spend a few seconds on it just to review it. Not a surprise, most of the things I just covered are things that we built into this tool. We're not the only one though, so there's a really exciting new market around cloud workload protection, which can be translated to basically Linux threat hunting, Linux threat protection that's emerging out there. We evaluate a lot of the market, and again, because of our internal threshold and what we look for in partners and the kind of data and information we're looking to get for our outcomes, decided to build our own solution. That is in no way a reflection that other solutions are not more than adequate. And if you're in an environment where, for example, you're widely deployed in Carbon Black, or you have a bunch of E5 licenses across everything you're doing, there are solutions within those vendors that absolutely check many of these boxes that you should go evaluate. On our side though, we do have a free trial. It's at redcanary.com/CWP or products cloud workload protection, where we give you 30 days, no questions asked to go. Basically, throw the kitchen sink at this. Deploy out sensors, see if it supports your versions and your cloud configurations. In many cases, red team it, see what you can break, see what we detect, see what we come back with. And then ultimately, if it's something that fits with you, select the tier and buy into it. If it's something where you're just interested in personal research, there's even a free offering where you can deploy it out and you have access to the sensor in our portal, and you can pipe all the telemetry we see back into your environment for analysis. It was really important for us to introduce something like that early on, just because, again, our philosophy here is get the right security outcomes, be the ally, make sure that you feel confident and comfortable in the cloud. If that's with us, fantastic. If it's not, we'll be more than happy to tell you where to go to get the right outcomes for it. So definitely check that out if you're interested in looking at cloud security and all. Even if you just want to have a deeper conversation around the risk and threat breakdown or anything we're seeing in the market, you can head there anytime or reach out to me, and I'm more than happy to walk you through it. Thanks for the time to give you an overview. Any questions around kind of anything cloud, all the way down to threat protection?
I've got one related to CI/CD. Just to kind of preface it, we've been, especially like the last year and a quarter, we've seen a lot of things go cloud, and then a lot of mistakes being made in cloud, like someone's GitLab is publicly accessible. We've seen their static analysis tool be publicly accessible, and people pull down source code. So going into the cloud presents those big challenges of how you get your dev team to actually push things out there. Could you talk about maybe some success stories or some best practices for CI/CD and getting the dev team to kind of start going to the cloud?
Yeah, it's a great one. I think it's the hardest challenge because it's a people problem. In my experience, at least, unfortunately, the best solution I've seen is heroics, where you have someone who is both a people manager and knowledgeable enough about the space to put in place best practices around securing some of those baseline processes and something like CI/CD, where there's a focus on, we have set up infrastructure as code that looks and smells like a very safe pattern. Our applications are developed with security first, and we do code reviews and PR reviews where we're really focusing in on preventing and introducing new vulnerabilities and looking actively at the code we're writing to make sure it's secure. We're regularly analyzing our dependencies and our vendors to make sure that there's no upstream vulnerability being introduced of our code, particularly when we look at cases like, what was it a couple of years ago, CCleaner, I believe, where you had a compromised repo, compromised build, and so everything you're pulling down is going to be compromised. That's becoming increasingly common in what we're seeing. And so I found that it takes somebody really able to step back and think about that issue in particular, and then go pick the right tools or processes to deal with that problem. Is there a push button solution? there's certainly help, particularly on the Kubernetes side. There's been a lot of focus lately on these platforms that don't just handle orchestration, but also analyzing your deployment to look for vulnerable images or active vulnerabilities within those images or misconfigurations that are easily addressed. But to my knowledge, at least, and I say this as somebody who's about to go build some of this for our platform as well, I find it all comes down to the human. And if you have a team that's really actively thinking about this and responsible for it, it's going to get you 90% of the way there. Actually, my last company was focused exclusively on patch management, vulnerability management, configuration management. And even with our tool set, it was only as good as the person running it. You really needed somebody who cared enough to apply the changes, make sure everything was patched and configured correctly, and then keep on top of it programmatically while also keeping up with all the normal tasks of DevOps and SRE to deploy out the software. Putting a tool in it, just like Red Canary, putting a tool in it won't really get far enough to solve the problem. It's going to come down to that leader.
So I have a question over on my end. First of all, do you have a contact information, or did I miss it to begin with?
No, I completely and totally failed to put that in the slide here, but let me drop it in the chat. So there's that. That's my email address. And again, anything across the board that we can help with, whether it's our solution or not, we're more than happy to help out. And we have a team that's about bordering on 300 now, including an in-house research team of about 75 people. So we're super excited to talk about anything related to security broadly.
So would you guys do stuff like helping us figure out run books and stuff that we actually need to look into an environment as it's being introduced as a new cloud environment?
Yeah, actually that's one of the major issues I'm picking off of my team in these next couple of quarters is how to think about responding to cloud threats generically. The major nuance is that there's not really a straightforward playbook because everybody has slightly different deployments. In the best case scenario, it's all machines that can be rapidly scaled up and down and re-imaged at whim. In reality, there's machines that can't be spun up or spun down. There's some kind of dependency or bottleneck that requires a different response process. So what we're looking at doing is authoring up a couple of just generic playbooks and chunks of advice on what to do when you get a cloud threat back. In many cases, that might just be re-image or isolate the machine, put it in a different security group without access to anything but your security tools or internal team. In other cases, it might be to do nothing. In some cases, it might be to immediately kick off an IR process. It really just depends on what it is or how severe it is. But it's definitely an area we're looking to invest in. It's something that's really well established in the EDR. Definitely not so much in the cloud side.
Okay, I'll have to pass your information up to our cloud people because we definitely need some help figuring this out.
Yeah, if it's any solace, even the biggest companies that we end up talking to, they're asking the same question. They know their infrastructure and they know what can't be touched, but when it comes to a threat, one of our philosophies is just to continue to throw people at it to see how we can help with it. So even if we have an established incident response relationship, or even if you use a different vendor or anything else, you'll find people on our team leaning in to go above and beyond to make sure that you feel confident in the response you're doing, even if it comes down to recommending a separate product. It's certainly something we do all the time.
All right.
Thanks. Excellent. Any other questions I can at least chat with on the cloud or security side? If not, I'll give you back some time. Excellent. Well, again, thank you all for the time to kind of step in here and walk you through what we're seeing. Again, it's a space where I think it's worth investing some time and a little bit of brain power right now because it's just evolving really quickly, and there are people coming up with some really novel solutions to these classically hard problems. Any aspect of it you can think of, whether it's that orchestration, the response, the Kubernetes management, we've really taken strides in the last couple of years. And as far as we can see, the horizon's really bright across the board. Not only across us, but across all the vendors playing here. The status quo and the bar have been raised really high now. And teams are really starting to invest in products that help answer a lot of the questions like that last one programmatically, so that you have to spend less time on essentially bespoke work and more time thinking about how to support your business and scale.
Thank you. Definitely thank you for the presentation. I was chatting with Steven on the side, and I was telling him, based on everything you were saying and the flow, that one thing I wish I could do is keep the balance between the super techie stuff and bringing it back to explaining where everyone can actually understand what you're talking about. So your speaking skills are definitely impressive. So I just wanted to compliment you on that.
I appreciate it. It's the fun condition of the reality of cloud security for us is that I talk to DevOps and I talk to SecOps. And as I'm sure all of you know, you either have an abrasive relationship or you hate each other actively. And so there's always a nice lens to kind of hold hands between those two groups and translate a lot of back and forth until people realize they're both trying to achieve the same goals.
For sure.